In a rundown Nevada roadhouse called the Silver Spur, a retired blues musician was about to play his final set before closing time. What began as a quiet desert night, filled with country songs and spilled beer, turned deadly when a gang of drunk bikers decided to make entertainment out of humiliation. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical old man in the corner nursing a whiskey. For decades, he'd been a special forces instructor and martial arts legend, known for ending violence before it began, with precision, patience, and a single look. When Grizzly Maddox and his biker crew started roughing up the guitarist, they had no idea they were performing in front of the wrong audience. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson rose from his stool, his warning ignored, and one bar stool shattered across a giant's back. A sound that silenced the entire room. That's when Chuck turned, his calm presence cutting through chaos, and delivered justice the way only legends can. Measured, final, unforgettable. What began as a barroom brawl would become a modern myth of restraint and redemption. The Silver Spur Saloon would never be the same after the night two icons reminded a broken world that real strength doesn't roar. It stands up quietly when it's needed most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Silver Spurs Saloon breathed like a living thing in the Nevada night. Neon signs casting red and blue shadows across cracked asphalt. The bass line from inside vibrating through weathered wooden walls and cigarette smoke drifting lazily through the desert air. It was the kind of place where stories were born and secrets died. Where truckers pulled off Highway 50 to wash road dust from their throats and bikers gathered to prove things that couldn't be proven anywhere else. Dwayne Johnson's rental car crunched over gravel as he parked between a Harley-Davidson and a mud-caked pickup truck. He sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, watching the chaos through dust-streaked windows. Inside, silhouettes moved against amber light, pool cues jabbing the air during heated arguments, waitresses weaving between tables like dancers avoiding landmines. And somewhere in the back, the soft wail of a blues guitar threading through the noise. He'd been driving for hours, needing to disappear into somewhere real after months of manufactured conversations and scripted interactions. The Silver Spur was perfect. Authentic grit, where no one expected to find Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson on a Wednesday night. The heavy door groaned as he pushed inside, and the wall of sound hit him like warm water. Laughter mixing with curses, the crack of pool balls, and beneath it all, that lonely guitar painting melancholy across the chaos. The air tasted of beer and leather and something indefinable that belonged only to places where people came to forget who they were supposed to be. Ruby Calhoun looked up from behind the bar, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, eyes that had seen everything twice. She didn't flinch when she recognized him, just nodded like he was any other traveler seeking shelter from the desert night. "What'll it be, honey?" she asked, voice growly from decades of speaking over crowds. "Beer? Whatever's cold," Dwayne replied, grateful for her easy manner. He settled onto a bar stool that creaked under his weight, scanning the room with a quiet assessment of someone who'd learned to read crowds before they read him. Near the back, on a small stage barely bigger than a dinner table, an elderly man hunched over a battered acoustic guitar. His fingers moved with the careful precision of age, coaxing notes that seemed to remember better times. Old Man Sawyer, though Dwayne didn't know his name yet, sang in a voice like whiskey and regret, each word carrying the weight of stories he'd never tell. The music should have been the heart of the room, but it was being drowned by something darker. At a table near the pool area, a mountain of a man held court with volume and violence. Grizzly Maddox, 6'16", and built like a construction crane, slammed his beer down hard enough to make nearby glasses jump. "You call that singing, old man?" Grizzly's voice cut through the guitar like a rusty blade. "Sounds like a cat dying in the desert." A few patrons laughed nervously. Others found sudden interest in their drinks. Grizzly fed on the attention, his grin widening as he looked around for validation. He was the kind of man who measured his worth in fear, who turned every room into his own personal arena. Dwayne's jaw tightened as he watched Grizzly mock Sawyer's trembling voice. Behind the bar, Ruby's face had gone stone-cold professional. The look of someone calculating how much damage she could afford before calling the sheriff. At the far end of the bar, nearly invisible in the shadows, another man sat perfectly still. Chuck Norris had chosen his seat with the precision of a sniper. Back to the wall, clear view of every entrance, close enough to the action to intervene, but far enough to assess. He'd been watching Grizzly all night, noting the pattern. Start with verbal intimidation, escalate to physical contact, then find the weakest target and break them for sport. Chuck had been coming to the Silver Spur for 20 years. He'd seen bullies before, men who confused noise with strength, who fed their insecurities with other people's fear. Usually, they burned themselves out on smaller prey. But Grizzly was different. Hungrier, more desperate, the kind of man who wouldn't stop until someone made him stop. Jenny Hartwell, barely 22 and working her way through community college, moved between tables like she was walking through a minefield. She'd learned to read the warning signs, the tightening of shoulders, the shift in voice, tone, the way conversation died when Grizzly looked your way. Her hands shook slightly as she collected empty glasses, praying the night would end without incident. But the desert had its own plans. Grizzly stood suddenly, his chair scraping against wood like fingernails on a chalkboard. The room's energy shifted, conversations faltering as all eyes tracked his movement. He'd been drinking just enough to sharpen his edges, and now his attention had locked onto something new. Old Man Sawyer continued playing, lost in his music, unaware that the storm was moving his direction. His fingers found a particularly sweet melody, something that spoke of distant mountains and love letters never sent. And for a moment, the whole bar seemed to lean in, remembering what beauty sounded like. That was when Grizzly made his choice. He lurched toward the stage, heavy boots thudding against the floor like a countdown timer. The guitar's melody wavered as Sawyer finally noticed the approaching threat, his weathered hands suddenly uncertain on the strings. "Hey, old-timer." Grizzly's voice carried the false friendliness of a predator. "How about you play something from this century? Or better yet, how about you hang up that guitar before you embarrass yourself any further?" The bar held its breath. Ruby's hand moved toward the phone. Jenny froze mid-step, a tray of drinks forgotten in her hands. And at his stool near the wall, Dwayne Johnson felt something ancient and protective stir in his chest. The same instinct that had driven him to stand between bullies and their victims since he was old enough to make a fist. The night was about to change. In the shadows at the end of the bar, Chuck Norris's eyes sharpened, his stillness becoming something more dangerous than movement. The Silver Spur had seen fights before, but it had never seen anything like what was coming. Sawyer's fingers stumbled on the strings as Grizzly loomed over him, the old man's shoulders hunching like he was trying to disappear into his guitar. The melody died mid-note, replaced by a silence that felt sharp enough to cut. "That's better," Grizzly said, his grins spreading wider. Now the grown-ups can have a conversation without that racket. He leaned closer, his shadow falling across Sawyer like a threat. "You know what I think, old man? I think it's time for you to retire. Permanently? The word permanently hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Jenny's tray clattered to the floor, beer and glass exploding across the wooden planks. The sound seemed to wake the entire bar from its frozen state. Some patrons shifting toward the exits, others pulling out phones to record what they sensed was coming. But Dwayne was already moving. He stood from his stool with the fluid grace of an athlete, his presence immediately commanding attention. Conversations died completely now as heads turned, recognition flickering in dozens of eyes. The Rock here now, standing up to face down the biggest man in the room. "That's enough," Dwayne said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made drill sergeants step aside. He walked forward slowly, hands loose at his sides, but ready. "The man's just trying to play some music. Leave him alone." Grizzly turned, and for a split second, surprise flickered across his features. Then the surprise morphed into something uglier, a combination of recognition, resentment, and opportunity. Here was the ultimate prize. The Rock himself, stepping into Grizzly's domain. "Well, well," Grizzly drawled, puffing up like a bird displaying its plumage. "Look what we got here. Mr. Hollywood Tough Guy thinks he can waltz into a real bar and tell real men what to do." He spread his arms wide, playing to the crowd. "This ain't one of your movies, Rock. No stunt doubles, no special effects, just you and me and gravity." Behind them, Sawyer tried to shrink further into his chair. His guitar clutched against his chest like a shield. Ruby had the phone in her hand, but hadn't dialed yet. She'd seen enough bar fights to know that sometimes they burned out before they exploded. But the tension in the air felt different tonight. Electric, dangerous. Dwayne took another step closer. Close enough now that Grizzly's beer breath washed over him. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, his voice still level, still controlled. "I'm just asking you to back off. The man hasn't done anything to you." "Hasn't done anything?" Grizzly's laugh was like broken glass. "He's been murdering my ears all night with that pitiful excuse for music. And now you come in here thinking your fame makes you bulletproof." He poked Dwayne's chest with one thick finger. "This is the real world, movie star. Time to see how tough you really are." At the end of the bar, Chuck Norris remained motionless, but his attention had sharpened to laser focus. He'd seen this dance before. The escalation, the point of no return, approaching like a freight train. Grizzly was past reasoning, past de-escalation. He was in the grip of something primal now, feeding on the crowd's energy and his own desperate need to prove himself. Dwayne caught the finger on Grizzly's next poke, his grip firm but not crushing. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Walk away." But Grizzly was already swinging. The punch came wild and heavy, telegraphed by rage and alcohol. Dwayne slipped it easily, years of athletic training making the movement look effortless. Grizzly stumbled past him off balance, and in that moment of vulnerability, Dwayne saw something that made his blood run cold. Grizzly was reaching for Sawyer. The old man sat frozen, paralyzed by memories of violence from a war fought 50 years ago. His hands trembled on his guitar as Grizzly's massive fist drew back, aimed not at Dwayne, but at the most defenseless person in the room. Instinct took over. Dwayne grabbed the nearest bar stool, solid oak, heavy as a sledgehammer, and brought it down across Grizzly's back with every ounce of strength he possessed. The wood exploded against bone and muscle with a crack that seemed to shake the walls. Grizzly pitched forward, his punch missing Sawyer by inches as he crashed to the floor in a tangle of splintered furniture and shocked silence. The entire bar seemed to inhale at once. A collective gasp that sucked all other sound from the room. Even the jukebox in the corner appeared to hold its breath, the needles skating across vinyl in sudden quiet. Jenny's scream pierced the silence like a knife. Oh God. Oh God. Is he? But Grizzly was already moving. He planted his hands on the floor and pushed himself up. Wood chips falling from his shirt like snow. His back should have been broken. His pride definitely was. When he turned to face Dwayne, his eyes held the kind of fury that belonged to wounded animals. Desperate, vicious, and completely without reason. You, he growled, blood trickling from his split lip. You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone? You think your fancy movies make you some kind of hero? He rose to his full height, swaying slightly, but radiating violence like heat from a furnace. The bar stool hadn't stopped him. It had only made him angrier, more dangerous. Around the room, patrons pressed against walls, some already heading for the exits. Ruby's voice cut through the tension. That's enough. Both of you out of my bar before. But her words died as every eye in the room turned toward the far end of the bar, where a single bar stool was slowly rotating. Chuck Norris had finally moved, turning with the deliberate precision of a clock hand to face the confrontation. The silence that followed was different from before. Deeper, heavier, pregnant with recognition and myth. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Is that Chuck Norris? Oh, Grizzly's bravado faltered for just a moment as he registered the legend sitting 30 FT away. But rage and alcohol made him stupid, and he was too far gone to back down now. Well, look at that, he called out, his voice cracking slightly. The whole Hollywood reunion is here. What's next? Going to call in the Avengers? Chuck stood with the fluid grace of a man half his age, placing his drink down with careful precision. He hadn't said a word yet, but his presence filled the room like pressure before a thunderstorm. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet as falling snow and twice as deadly. The lady asked you to leave. 3 words. That was all. But they carried the weight of a lifetime spent perfecting the difference between strength and violence, between power and its responsibility. Grizzly looked between Chuck and Dwayne, his alcoholed brain trying to process the impossible situation he'd created. 2 legends in his bar on his night. Either he was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons, or he was about to become a cautionary tale. But fear had never stopped him before, and pride wouldn't let him stop now. You know what he said, spreading his arms wide like he was embracing his fate. This is perfect. 2 has been actors, against 1 real fighter. Let's see what you've really got. Behind the bar, Ruby was already dialing 911. Jenny had pressed herself against the wall, clutching an empty tray like armor. And somewhere in the growing chaos, Old Man Sawyer began to understand that his simple desire to play music had lit the fuse on something much bigger and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The Silver Spurs Saloon was about to earn its place in legend. But first, it would have to survive the storm that was coming. The bar had fallen into the kind of silence that exists just before earthquakes, a stillness so complete it seemed to press against the eardrums. Every patron held their breath as Chuck Norris stood at the far end of the room, his presence transforming the ramshackle saloon into something approaching a cathedral. The neon beer signs cast colored shadows across his weathered face, but his eyes remained clear and focused as winter stars. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Grizzly Maddox found himself caught between 2 forces of nature, the rock's protective intensity burning behind him and Chuck's ancient calm emanating from across the room. For the first time in his adult life, the giant felt small. But alcohol and wounded pride are dangerous mixtures, and retreat was no longer an option he could see. "This is Rich," Grizzly said, his voice pitched higher than before, adrenaline making him louder and more desperate. "The two biggest frauds in Hollywood tag-teaming me in some dive bar. What's the matter? Need backup to handle one real man?" Chuck walked forward with the measured pace of a man who had learned long ago that haste was the enemy of precision. Each step was deliberate, controlled, like a master calligrapher drawing lines that would define the rest of the evening. He stopped exactly 10 feet away, close enough to act far enough to assess. "Nobody's tag-teaming anyone," Dwayne said, glancing between Chuck and Grizzly. He could feel the shift in the room's energy, the way the very air seemed to thicken around the older man. "This doesn't have to go any further?" Chuck's eyes flicked to Dwayne for just a moment, taking measure, finding character, making calculations that went beyond mere physical assessment. What he saw seemed to satisfy him because he gave the slightest nod before returning his attention to Grizzly. "You broke furniture in Ruby's bar," Chuck said, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "Threatened an old man who never did you harm. Scared a young woman just trying to earn an honest living." He paused, letting each word settle like stones in still water. "That's 3 strikes in my book." Ruby Calhoun watched from behind her bar, phone still in hand, but finger hovering over the dial button. She'd known Chuck for 20 years, had watched him diffuse more situations than most people saw in a lifetime. But she'd also seen what happened when someone pushed past his considerable patience. The last man who'd gotten Chuck truly angry had woken up 3 days later in a hospital in Reno with no clear memory of how he'd gotten there. Around the room, the other patrons were either edging toward exits or pulling out phones, sensing they were about to witness something that would be talked about for decades. The biker brothers, Boone and Cutter, had been Grizzly's loudest supporters all evening. But now they sat frozen at their table, suddenly unsure whose side they wanted to be on. Jenny pressed herself against the wall near the stage where Old Man Sawyer still clutched his guitar like a talisman. The old veteran's eyes were distant, lost in memories of other conflicts in other places. But his hands had stopped shaking. Something about Chuck's presence had reminded him of officers he'd served under, men who spoke softly, but carried authority in their bones. "You want to know what I think?" Grizzly said, trying to summon his earlier bravado, but sounding more like a man whistling past a graveyard. "I think you're both washed-up has-beens living on old reputations. I think when push comes to shove, you're just actors playing tough guys." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an empty arena. Several patrons actually winced, understanding that Grizzly had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Chuck's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A subtle settling, like a foundation being laid for what was to come. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than before, which somehow made it infinitely more dangerous. "You think reputation is just acting?" Chuck asked. "You think respect is something that gets handed out with paychecks and publicity photos?" Dwayne found himself studying Chuck's face, seeing something he recognized from his own journey. The weight of understanding that strength wasn't about what you could do to people, but what you chose not to do. The older man radiated the kind of confidence that came from having nothing left to prove to anyone. "I think," Grizzly said, his voice climbing toward hysteria that you're both full of. The word died in his throat as Chuck took another step forward. It was just one step, no faster or more dramatic than the others. But something in the quality of the movement made every person in the room suddenly aware of their own mortality. This was what apex predators looked like when they stopped pretending to be anything else. Ruby's finger finally moved on the phone, but not to dial 911. Instead, she touched the contact for someone else entirely. Sheriff Dalton Briggs, who had been cleaning up messes in this county for 30 years, and who developed a healthy respect for Chuck Norris's judgment. "Now, boys," she called out, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from managing drunks and fighters for half her life. "This has gone far. This has gone enough. Grizzly, you've had too much to drink and too little since. Why don't you sleep it off in the back room before you do something you can't take back?" But Grizzly was past the point where reason could reach him. Cornered and humiliated, he did what cornered animals always do. He prepared to lash out at anything within reach. His eyes darted between Chuck and Dwayne, calculating odds that would have been poor even if he'd been sober and rational. That was when Boone and Cutter made their fatal mistake. The biker brothers had been drinking all night, feeding off Grizzly's aggression and basking in the reflected glory of his bullying. Now, with their hero backed into a corner, they decided to even the odds. Boone stood first, a wiry man with prison tattoos and a mouthful of gold teeth. Cutter followed, bigger and dumber, but equally eager for violence. "Hey, old man," Boone called to Chuck, his voice slurred with beer and bravado. "Why don't you pick on someone your own age? Or better yet, go home and take your nap." That was the spark that lit the fuse. Cutter grabbed a chair and hurled it toward the far wall, just missing a table full of truckers who scrambled for cover. The crash of splintering wood seemed to break whatever invisible dam had been holding back the chaos. Suddenly, everyone was moving at once. Some toward exits, others toward each other, and all hell prepared to break loose in the Silver Spur Saloon. But in the eye of the approaching storm, Chuck Norris and Dwayne Johnson stood perfectly still. Two men who had just realized they were about to become partners in something that neither of them had wanted. But both of them were prepared to finish. The chair's explosion against the wall triggered an avalanche of violence that had been building pressure all evening like water behind a cracking dam. The sound of splintering wood seemed to release something primal in the room, a collective exhale of tension that transformed civilized patrons into participants in humanity's oldest form of conflict resolution. Boone launched himself at a trucker who'd been minding his own business at a corner table, his gold teeth gleaming in the neon light as he threw a sucker punch that caught the larger man completely off guard. The trucker, a veteran of the long haul who'd seen his share of roadhouse violence, absorbed the blow and came back swinging, his ham-sized fists connecting with Boone's solar plexus in a way that doubled the biker over and sent his beer gut rippling like disturbed water. Cutter grabbed a pool cue from the nearby table and began swinging it like a club. His technique more enthusiasm than skill, but dangerous nonetheless. The heavy wooden stick whistled through the air, missing heads by inches and connecting with shoulders and backs with dull, meaty sounds that made witnesses woos. A cocktail waitress screamed as the improvised weapon shattered a mirror behind the bar, sending glass cascading like deadly rain. Other patrons, fueled by alcohol and the primitive excitement of watching legends fight, either dove for cover or threw themselves into the melee, with the enthusiasm of spectators who'd suddenly found themselves part of the show. A fight between two men over a spilled drink escalated into a three-way brawl that knocked over an entire table. Beer bottles became projectiles, ashtrays turned into weapons, and the careful ecosystem of the Silver Spur devolved into pure chaos. But the legends weren't fighting each other. Chuck moved first, intercepting Cutter's pool cue with a block so precise it looked choreographed for a Hollywood fight scene. His forearm met the wooden shaft at the exact moment of maximum leverage. The impact sending vibrations up through Cutter's hands and arms that numbed his fingers and made him drop his improvised weapon with a surprised yelp. The physics were elegant in their simplicity. Force meeting force at the perfect angle to neutralize momentum without creating excessive damage. Chuck had calculated the interception with the precision of a mathematician, understanding exactly how much energy to absorb and how much to redirect before Cutter could recover from the shock of having his weapon neutralized so effortlessly. Chuck had stepped inside his guard and delivered a surgical strike to a pressure point just below the rib cage. It was a technique that required intimate knowledge of human anatomy, the exact spot where nerves clustered beneath muscle, where applied pressure could short-circuit the body's electrical system without causing permanent damage. Cutter folded like a house of cards built on quicksand, his massive frame crumpling as his diaphragm seized and his lungs forgot how to process air. He hit the floor, gasping like a landed fish, his eyes wide with a universal expression of someone who had just learned the difference between movie violence and the real thing. Across the room, Dwayne caught Boone mid-tackle as the wiry biker tried to blindside him while he was watching Chuck's demonstration of precision violence. The impact should have sent both men sprawling, but Dwayne's wrestling background kicked in automatically. He absorbed the kinetic energy, shifted his weight, and redirected Boone's momentum into a nearby table with the fluid grace of a matador, guiding a charging bull. Beer bottles scattered like bowling pins, their contents mixing with sawdust and broken glass to create a treacherous slurry on the floor that would make footing uncertain for anyone foolish enough to continue fighting. The crash was spectacular, but controlled. Dwayne had managed to use Boone's own aggression against him while minimizing collateral damage. "This isn't what I wanted." Dwayne called out to Chuck over the growing chaos, deflecting a wild punch from another drunk patron who decided that anyone standing was fair game in the expanding melee. His voice carried a note of frustration that spoke to something deeper than the immediate situation. The weight of understanding that good intentions could spiral beyond control. "Never is," Chuck replied, sidestepping a charging biker who had apparently decided that rushing the legend would somehow restore his fallen comrade's honor. Chuck used the man's own momentum to send him headfirst into the jukebox, which sparked and died with a shower of sparks and the electronic death rattle of circuits shorting out. The machine's final song cut short mid-note, adding an oddly poignant soundtrack to the violence. Question is whether we're going to control it or let it control us. The philosophical observation was delivered with the calm matter-of-factness of someone discussing weather. Patterns, but it carried deeper meaning. This was the eternal challenge of those who possessed real power, the constant choice between using strength to dominate or to protect, between letting anger guide action or maintaining the discipline to fight only for what mattered around them. The Silver Spur was transforming into a war zone that would have made any movie stunt coordinator proud. Tables overturned as combatants sought cover or improvised weapons. Chairs flew through the air with a random trajectory of artillery shells. The distinctive percussion of breaking glass provided a chaotic soundtrack for screams, curses, and the meaty sounds of fists connecting with flesh. The violence was spreading like wildfire, feeding on itself as adrenaline and alcohol lowered inhibitions and eliminated the normal social restraints that kept people civilized. Men who had entered the bar as strangers found themselves locked in combat over perceived slights or simply because they were caught up in the momentum of mayhem. Ruby had abandoned her post behind the bar, her maternal instincts overriding business concerns as she dragged Old Man Sawyer toward the relative safety of the storage room. The elderly musician moved like a man in a trance, his weathered hands still clutching his guitar, while his eyes held the distant look of someone reliving memories from a jungle war fought decades earlier. "Stay down, Sawyer," Ruby shouted over the chaos, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of managing situations that teetered on the edge of disaster. "This ain't your fight, honey." Jenny found herself cornered near the stage by a drunk trucker who seemed to think the chaos was an invitation to settle old grievances with anyone within reach. The man wryer of diesel fuel and stale beer, his bloodshot eyes holding the unfocused aggression of someone who had spent too many lonely hours on dark highways, nursing imaginary slights. She clutched her empty tray like a shield, backing away until she hit the wall with nowhere left to run. The trucker advanced with the patient certainty of a predator who had cornered his prey, his meaty hands reaching out with intentions that had nothing to do with the broader fight and everything to do with opportunistic violence. That was when Chuck appeared beside her, moving like smoke given form. One moment the space was empty, the next he was there, positioned between Jenny and the threat, with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of being exactly where he needed to be at precisely the right moment. The trucker's punch never landed. Chuck's hand intercepted it with the precision of a surgeon, his fingers wrapping around the larger man's wrist and applying pressure to nerve points that sent lightning bolts of pain shooting up the attacker's arm. The joint lock was applied with just enough force to immobilize without breaking bones, though the trucker's surprised yelp suggested he wasn't entirely sure his wrist was still functional. "Stay behind the bar," Chuck told Jenny, his voice calm despite the mayhem surrounding them. There was something almost supernatural about his ability to maintain conversational tones while applying devastating techniques to would-be attackers. "Ruby will keep you safe." Meanwhile, Dwayne found himself face to face with Grizzly again, the massive man having used the chaos to circle around for another assault. But this time was different. This time, Grizzly wasn't just angry. He was desperate, cornered, and completely unhinged. The humiliation of being dropped by a broken bar stool had stripped away whatever thin veneer of sanity alcohol had left him. "You ruined everything," Grizzly roared, swinging wild haymakers that whistled through the air where Dwayne's head had been moments before. His technique had devolved from poor to non-existent, pure rage-driving movements that were more tantrum than tactical. This was supposed to be my night, my place, your place. Dwayne caught one of the punches and twisted, using Grizzly's own strength and momentum against him in a move that would have made his wrestling coaches proud. The leverage was perfect, turning the larger man's aggression into a tool for his own defeat. This is everyone's place. That's what you never understood. But as they grappled, Dwayne became aware of something that made his protective instincts flare like warning sirens. The fight was spreading beyond the main combatants. Innocent people were getting hurt. A waitress screamed as a flying bottle caught her shoulder, drawing blood and sending her stumbling toward the exit. An elderly regular cowered under a table as boots and fists flew overhead, his frail frame vulnerable to the random violence that characterized mob conflicts. The chaos was feeding on itself, growing beyond anyone's ability to contain through conventional means. What had started as a confrontation between a bully and those who stood up to him had metastasized into something uglier and more dangerous. A riot in miniature, complete with all the random cruelty and collateral damage that such events produced. Chuck seemed to sense the same thing as he delivered a controlled strike to another aggressive patron, dropping the man with clinical precision, while simultaneously scanning the room for other threats. Despite his surgical efficiency in neutralizing individual attackers, Moore kept appearing like some kind of violent hydra. For every drunk he subdued, 2 more seemed to emerge from the woodwork, eager to be part of the legend being written in real time. "This is getting out of hand," Chuck called out, blocking a chair that someone had thrown in his general direction. His voice carried a note of concern that had nothing to do with personal safety and everything to do with the welfare of innocent bystanders who were caught in the crossfire. "Tell me about it," Dwayne replied, catching Grizzly in a headlock and trying to squeeze sense into him without cutting off his air supply entirely. The technique required perfect calibration, enough pressure to subdue without causing permanent damage, a balancing act that spoke to years of training and controlled violence. How do we shut it down? The question hung in the air between them as they continued to defend themselves and others from the expanding chaos. Both men understood that their presence had inadvertently escalated the situation. The excitement of seeing real celebrities in conflict had driven otherwise rational people to acts of violence they would never have contemplated under normal circumstances. That was when Chuck did something that surprised everyone in the room, including Dwayne. He grabbed an empty beer bottle from a nearby table and struck it hard against the edge of the bar, creating a sharp crack that somehow cut through all the other noise like a knife through fabric. The sound was distinctive, commanding, impossible to ignore even in the midst of chaos. In the momentary quiet that followed, his voice carried to every corner of the saloon with the kind of authority that transcended volume. It was the voice of someone who expected to be obeyed not because of threats or intimidation, but because of the moral weight he carried. Enough. The word wasn't shouted. It wasn't threatening in any conventional sense. It was simply stated with the absolute authority of someone who expected to be obeyed, backed by the kind of presence that made people remember they were capable of better choices. And incredibly, impossibly, the room began to settle. Fists paused mid-swing as if frozen in time. Curses died on lips like candles being snuffed out. Even the most drunk and belligerent patrons found themselves responding to something primal and undeniable in Chuck's tone. The voice of a natural leader, someone who commanded respect through character rather than force. The silence that spread through the Silver Spur was different from the earlier tension-filled quiet. This was the silence of recognition, of people suddenly remembering who they were supposed to be when they weren't caught up in mob mentality and liquid courage. It was the kind of moment that reminded everyone present why some people became legends while others remained footnotes in other people's stories. The silence that followed Chuck's command hung over the Silver Spur like morning mist over a battlefield. Overturned tables and scattered glass created a landscape of destruction that would have looked at home in a war zone. But the human chaos had frozen mid-motion. Fists remained cocked but unthrown. Bottles hung suspended in grips that had forgotten their purpose. Even the most belligerent drunks found themselves blinking in confusion, as if waking from a violent dream they couldn't quite remember starting. But amid the broken furniture and gasping patrons, one figure remained unmoved by Chuck's authority. Grizzly Maddox stood in the center of the wreckage like a monument to stubborn pride. Sweat and blood from his split lip making him look like some kind of wounded beast. His massive chest heaved with exertion and rage, his eyes holding the flat, dangerous stare of an animal that had been backed so far into a corner that forward was the only direction left. The momentary peace Chuck had imposed fragile as spun glass, and everyone in the room could sense it. The other patrons began to edge away from Grizzly, creating a natural arena in the center of the bar. Some pulled out phones again, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be worth capturing. Others simply pressed themselves against walls, understanding instinctively that they were about to witness the final act of a drama that had been building all evening. "You think one word stops this?" Grizzly's voice was from shouting, but it carried across the silent room with the weight of absolute desperation. His hands shook slightly, Whether from adrenaline, alcohol, or the dawning realization of how thoroughly he'd isolated himself, was impossible to determine. "You think your fancy reputation means anything when it's just me and you?" He looked around the room wildly, noting how the other patrons had already started to distance themselves from him. The biker brothers were gone, having slipped out during the chaos, with the survival instincts of rats abandoning a sinking ship. The crowd that had cheered his earlier bullying was melting away like snow in spring rain. Even Ruby was treating him like a problem to be solved rather than a force to be respected. Jenny peered out from behind the bar, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. She'd lived her entire young life in small Nevada towns where violence was usually quick and decisive. Bar fights that lasted 30 seconds and ended with someone buying rounds for the house. But this felt different. Epic somehow. Like she was watching the collision of different eras, different philosophies of what it meant to be strong. Old Man Sawyer clutched his guitar tighter, his weathered hands remembering other conflicts where violence had been the only language left to speak. But those had been wars with clear sides and defined objectives. This was something more personal, more primal, the kind of confrontation that reduced complex men to their essential natures. "You want to know what I think?" Grizzly continued, his voice cracking with desperation and fury. "I think it's time to find out if legends bleed like everyone else." The words carried the finality of a man who had nothing left to lose. Grizzly had built his identity around being the biggest, the meanest, the most feared. Having that stripped away in front of witnesses was more than his ego could bear. If he was going down, he was taking someone with him. Preferably someone whose defeat would restore his reputation as a force to be reckoned with. He charged both men at once, arms spread wide like he was trying to tackle a football team. It was a move born of desperation rather than strategy. The kind of all-or-nothing assault that usually ended with the attacker unconscious and everyone else shaking their heads at the stupidity of it all. Both Chuck and Dwayne could see it coming from a mile away. The telegraphed desperation, the poor form, the complete absence of any coherent plan beyond hoping that bulk and fury would somehow overcome skill and preparation. Under normal circumstances, either man could have ended the confrontation with minimal effort, leaving Grizzly in a heap while they walked away unmarked. But instead of stepping aside, instead of letting Grizzly crash into the wall and end this farce with the anticlimactic thud it deserved, they did something unexpected. They stepped toward him. Together, Grizzly's charge was met not with resistance, but with redirection. As Chuck and Dwayne moved in perfect synchronization, despite never having fought together before. It was like watching two master musicians play an improvised duet, each anticipating the other's movements, filling spaces, creating harmony from what should have been chaos. Chuck took Grizzly's left arm, his hands finding the precise pressure points that would disrupt the larger man's balance without causing permanent damage. His technique was surgical in its precision, applying force with the mathematical certainty of someone who understood exactly how much pressure was needed to achieve the desired result. Dwayne caught Grizzly's right shoulder simultaneously, guiding the massive man into a controlled stumble rather than a devastating crash. His wrestling background showed in the way he managed the momentum, turning potentially destructive force into something manageable and contained. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Grizzly found himself supported by the very men he tried to destroy. Their combined strength kept him upright, when his own fury would have sent him sprawling into broken furniture and shattered glass. It was an act of mercy disguised as tactical necessity, though whether Grizzly recognized it as such was questionable. But he was too far gone to recognize mercy, too deep in the grip of wounded pride to accept anything that looked like charity from his enemies. "Get off me!" Grizzly roared, breaking. free from their controlled support and swinging wild punches that connected with nothing but air. His technique had devolved completely now. No strategy, no defense, just the flailing desperation of a man who had forgotten everything except the need to hurt someone, anyone, in order to restore his damaged sense of self. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the blood from his split lip to create a mask of violence that made him look more beast than man. His breathing was ragged, labored, the result of too much alcohol, too little conditioning, and too much adrenaline flooding a system that wasn't equipped to handle the strain. The remaining patrons pressed against the walls, creating a natural arena in the center of the bar. The silence was complete now, except for Grizzly's harsh breathing and the soft sounds of Chuck and Dwayne's footsteps as they circled him with the patience of experienced hunters who knew their quarry was already beaten. "This ends now," Dwayne said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. He moved to Grizzly's right with fluid grace, every step calculated to maintain distance while closing off escape routes. There was something almost ceremonial about his approach, like he was participating in a ritual older than the building around them. Chuck moved left with equal precision, his positioning designed to provide support while allowing Dwayne to take the lead. It was a subtle gesture of respect, acknowledging that the Rock had been the first to stand up for the innocent, that he had earned the right to finish what Grizzly had started. "You want to know the difference between us and you?" Chuck asked, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher explaining a difficult concept to a slow student. Each word was chosen carefully, delivered with the kind of measured authority that came from decades of understanding the true nature of strength. "We don't fight to prove we're strong. We fight to protect what matters." Grizzly's response was a roar of pure rage as he launched himself at Chuck, perhaps thinking the older man would be the easier target. It was the last coherent decision he would make while standing, the final mistake in a long evening of increasingly poor choices. Chuck's counter was poetry written in physics, a simple sidestep that used Grizzly's momentum against him, followed by a precise strike to a nerve cluster just below the shoulder blade. The technique was perfect in its execution, requiring intimate knowledge of human anatomy and the kind of split-second timing that could only come from decades of practice. The strike sent lightning bolts of pain up Grizzly's spine, disrupting his nervous system and causing his left arm to go temporarily numb. But instead of following up with devastating force that could have ended the fight permanently, Chuck pulled his next punch, delivering just enough impact to stagger without causing lasting damage. It was a demonstration of the kind of restraint that separated true masters from mere fighters. The ability to use precisely the amount of force necessary to achieve the desired outcome. No more and no less. Chuck could have broken bones, could have left Grizzly with injuries that would last for months. Instead, he chose to simply disable, to remove the threat without destroying the man. Grizzly spun around, his equilibrium shot, his left arm hanging useless at his side. The pain was extraordinary, but it was the kind of pain that would fade with time rather than the permanent agony of serious injury. He stumbled, trying to reorient himself, just in time for Dwayne to catch him with a controlled right hook that snapped his head back and sent him staggering toward the bar. But again, the force was calibrated with surgical precision. Dwayne had thrown the punch with enough power to end the fight, but not enough to cause serious brain damage. It was the kind of technique that required not just physical skill, but moral courage. The discipline to hold back even when facing someone who deserved no mercy. The blow caught Grizzly flush on the jaw, but instead of the devastating knockout that his behavior had earned, it was more like a firm correction. A reminder that actions had consequences, that choices mattered, that the universe had a way of balancing scales even when human justice seemed absent. Ruby watched from behind her bar as Grizzly's legs gave out, and he slumped to the floor, conscious but thoroughly defeated. The fall was almost gentle, controlled by the same principles that had guided every aspect of Chuck and Dwayne's response to his aggression. He landed on his back among the debris of overturned furniture and broken dreams, staring up at the ceiling with a dazed expression of someone who had just discovered that the world didn't work the way he thought it did. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses in the violence. This one felt final, complete, like a book closing on its last page. There was a weight to it, a sense that something important had been settled, not just through force, but through the demonstration of principles that transcended mere physical dominance. Jenny stepped out from behind the bar cautiously, her movements tentative as she assessed whether the danger had truly passed. Her eyes moved between the two legends and the fallen bully, trying to process what she had witnessed. This wasn't the Hollywood version of violence she was familiar with. There had been no dramatic speeches, no over-the-top brutality, no clear division between good and evil. Instead, she had seen something more complex and ultimately more powerful. The kind of restrained strength that spoke to genuine character. The difference between men who used violence as a tool and those who saw it as a regrettable necessity. Old Man Sawyer shakily returned to his feet. His guitar still clutched against his chest like armor. The weapon of music seemed almost absurd in the aftermath of physical conflict, but somehow appropriate. Art and beauty persisting despite humanity's capacity for ugliness. Creativity surviving in the face of destruction. "You had everything backward?" Dwayne said, looking down at Grizzly with something that might have been pity. His voice was gentle now, stripped of the controlled aggression that had characterized the fight. "You thought strength meant making people afraid of you. But real strength is making them feel safe around you." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have, cutting through Grizzly's alcoholic haze to reach whatever remained of his capacity for self-reflection. He blinked up at the ceiling, his mind struggling to process the idea that everything he'd believed about power and respect might have been fundamentally wrong. Chuck knelt beside the fallen man, checking his pulse and pupils with the efficiency of someone who'd seen more than his share of violence and its aftermath. His touch was professional, clinical, but not unkind. Even in defeat, even after everything that had happened, Grizzly was still a human being deserving of basic care. Satisfied that the damage was temporary rather than permanent, Chuck stood and dusted off his hands with a matter-of-fact air of someone completing a distasteful but necessary task. "Fear is cheap," Chuck added, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom accumulated over decades of understanding what real strength meant. "Any fool with a loud voice and a mean streak can inspire fear. But respect that has to be earned every day, with every choice you make." The lesson hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, sacred and transformative for those willing to receive it. Around the room, the other patrons began to absorb what they had witnessed. Not just a fight, but a masterclass in the difference between power and responsibility, between strength and wisdom. The Silver Spur Saloon would return to normal eventually. Tables would be righted, glass would be swept up, and new stories would replace tonight's drama. But for this moment, in the aftermath of violence and the presence of genuine heroism, it felt like something more than just another desert bar. It felt like a place where legends were born and character was tested, where the true measure of a man could be taken not by how hard he could hit, but by how much he could hold back when holding back mattered most. Sheriff Dalton Briggs pushed through the heavy door of the Silver Spur with the weary expression of a man who'd seen this movie too many times before, though never quite with this particular cast of characters. His hand rested casually on his service weapon, not from any sense of immediate threat, but from the kind of professional habit that kept rural lawmen breathing in counties where backup was measured in hours rather than minutes. The scene that greeted him was like something from a disaster movie's aftermath. Overturned tables created a landscape of broken dreams and splintered wood. Shattered glass crunched underfoot like gravel on a country road. Each step producing a symphony of destruction that told its own story of the evening's violence. The faint smell of spilled beer mixing with sawdust and something that might have been fear or adrenaline. It was hard to tell the difference after 28 years of law enforcement in a county where Saturday nights regularly ended with ambulance calls. But what struck Dalton most wasn't the destruction. He'd seen plenty of bar fights that had left similar calling cards. What struck him was the calm. Despite the chaos written in broken furniture and scattered belongings, the human element of the scene felt oddly peaceful. No one was screaming. No one was bleeding from serious injuries. The patrons who remained, and most had stayed, rather than fleeing like guilty parties, sat quietly nursing their drinks and their dignity with the shell-shocked expression of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. "Evening?" Ruby, Dalton said, tipping his hat to the bartender who stood surveying her damaged kingdom with a philosophical acceptance of someone who'd seen empires rise and fall behind her bar. "Got a call about some kind of disturbance. Dispatch said something about chairs flying and legends bleeding." He paused, taking in the scope of the destruction with professional assessment. Though from the look of things, the legends seemed to have come out better than the furniture. Ruby snorted, a sound that managed to convey both exasperation and grudging admiration in a single exhalation. She'd been cleaning up after men's poor decisions for 40 years, and tonight's drama was just another chapter in an endless book of human folly. Legends didn't do much bleeding. Dalton can't say the same for some folks' pride. Dalton's eyes swept the room methodically, cataloging details with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that the truth of any situation was usually written in the evidence, rather than the testimonies. He noted the scattered patrons who were suddenly very interested in their drinks, the broken furniture that would need replacing, and most remarkably, the two men who stood quietly near the bar like they were waiting for a bus instead of a police investigation. Dwayne Johnson and Chuck Norris in his bar on his watch on a Wednesday night in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. "Christ on a cracker," Dalton muttered under his breath, removing his hat to scratch his graying hair. He'd dealt with celebrity incidents before. Drunk movie stars who thought their fame exempted them from speed limits, entitled athletes who confused their contract values with their actual worth as human beings. Musicians who believed their ability to carry a tune somehow granted them diplomatic immunity from the laws of physics and good sense. But this was different. These weren't pampered celebrities looking to raise hell in some backwater town where they thought they wouldn't be recognized. These were icons, living legends, men who had spent decades building reputations that transcended their original professions to become something approaching mythology. And they were standing in the middle of his crime scene, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else, with the kind of uncomfortable dignity that suggested they understood the awkwardness of their situation and were prepared to face whatever consequences their actions had earned. Dalton pulled out his notebook with the air of a man settling in for a long story, though experience had taught him that the length of the investigation was usually inversely proportional to the clarity of the truth. Simple cases took forever because everyone had something to hide. Complex situations often resolved themselves quickly when the facts were obvious and the witnesses were honest. "All right," he said, clicking his pen with the deliberate ceremony of someone beginning an official process. Somebody want to tell me what happened here? And please, for the love of all that's holy, start from the beginning and stick to facts. I've got paperwork to fill out and my wife's holding dinner." Jenny stepped forward before anyone else could speak, her hands clasped in front of her like a schoolgirl called to the principal's office. But her voice was steady when she spoke, carrying the conviction of someone who'd seen truth in action and wasn't afraid to testify to it. The events of the evening had aged her somehow, replacing the nervous uncertainty of youth with something approaching wisdom. "Grizzly Maddox was drunk and picking fights," she said, her words carefully chosen, but delivered with absolute certainty. "He threatened Mr. Sawyer, scared half the customers, and was getting ready to hurt someone real bad. Mr. Johnson tried to stop it peacefully, but Grizzly attacked him first. Then, when things got out of hand, Mr. Norris helped calm everyone down before anyone got seriously hurt." Her testimony was concise but comprehensive, hitting all the key points that would matter in any official report. But more than that, it carried the weight of genuine gratitude. This wasn't someone trying to protect celebrities because of their fame. This was a young woman who understood that she'd witnessed something rare and valuable. "That's the short version," Ruby added, automatically refilling Dalton's coffee cup from the pot she'd somehow managed to keep brewing despite the chaos. The gesture was pure muscle memory, the kind of hospitality that survived wars, depressions, and bar fights with equal resilience. Long version is that we had a bully problem that got solved by a couple of gentlemen who know the difference between fighting and defending. The distinction Ruby drew wasn't lost on Dalton, who'd spent enough time in uniform to understand that violence could serve different masters. There was violence that created problems and violence that solved them. And the difference usually came down to motivation and restraint. Around the room, other patrons began to nod in agreement, some even speaking up to corroborate the story with details that painted a consistent picture. The trucker who'd been harassed earlier testified to Grizzly's escalating aggression. An elderly woman who'd witnessed the confrontation described Chuck's attempts at de-escalation. Even some of the men who'd gotten caught up in the broader melee admitted that the legends had been trying to minimize damage rather than maximize it. Dalton looked around the room again, noting the absence of the obvious suspects. "Where's the alleged aggressor now?" "Parking lot," Chuck said, speaking for the first time since the sheriff's arrival. His voice carried the same quiet authority that had stopped the riot earlier. But now it was tempered with something that might have been amusement. "Cuffed to your deputy's cruiser, I believe, conscious, but reconsidering his life choices." The description was delivered with such matter-of-fact precision that Dalton almost smiled. Chuck Norris had a reputation for understatement that was as legendary as his martial arts skills. If he said Grizzly was reconsidering his life choices, it probably meant the man was having a full-scale existential crisis. "And the Hartley brothers. Boone and Cutter took off about 10 minutes ago," Ruby said, beginning to clean glasses with the kind of automatic efficiency that suggested normally was returning to the Silver Spur. "Probably halfway to Reno by now, assuming they can still see straight enough to drive." The biker brothers' hasty departure was probably the smartest decision they'd made all evening. Dalton had dealt with them before. Small-time troublemakers who specialized in intimidating people who couldn't fight back and running when faced with real consequences. Their absence simplified his job considerably. Dalton made notes with the methodical pace of someone who'd learned not to rush these things. In his experience, bar fights were like onions. The more layers you peeled back, the more likely you were to cry. But something about this situation felt different, cleaner somehow, the kind of straightforward case that made up for all the complicated messes that usually crossed his desk. Any witnesses want to contradict the story I'm hearing? He asked, raising his voice to address the room. Anyone see these two gentlemen start trouble, throw the first punch, or act in any way that wasn't pure self-defense? The silence that followed spoke louder than testimonies. Not only did no one contradict the narrative that was emerging, several patrons actually went out of their way to vouch for what they'd witnessed. The story was consistent, simple, and backed by people who had no reason to lie for strangers. More importantly, Dalton's own assessment of the scene supported what he was hearing. The destruction was extensive, but not random. Furniture was overturned and broken, but in patterns that suggested controlled violence rather than mindless mayhem. There were no bloodstains indicating serious injuries, no evidence of weapons beyond improvised items like pool cues and bottles. Even the broken mirror behind the bar had been caused by a deflected pool cue rather than deliberate vandalism. "Mr. Johnson," Dalton said, turning to face the actor directly, "you want to tell me why you decided to get involved? Most celebrities I know would have called security and headed for the nearest exit." The question was fair, and Dalton's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. In his experience, fame usually made people more cautious about getting involved in other people's problems, not less. The smart play for someone with Dwayne's profile would have been to document the situation on video and let someone else deal with the consequences. Dwayne's answer was immediate and honest, delivered without the careful phrasing of someone who'd been coached by lawyers or publicists. Old man was about to get hurt. Someone had to do something. The simplicity of the response was its power. No grand speeches about justice or heroism. No attempts to justify his actions with complex moral arguments. Just the basic human recognition that someone defenseless was in danger and needed protection. It was the kind of motivation that even the most cynical law enforcement officer could understand and respect. "And you, Mr. Norris, what's your version?" Chuck's response was even more economical, delivered with the precision of someone who'd learned to waste neither words nor actions. Ruby asked him to leave. He wouldn't listen. Sometimes you have to help people understand when the conversation is over. Again, the explanation was refreshingly direct. No philosophical discussions about the nature of justice or the responsibility of the strong to protect the weak. Just a simple acknowledgement that sometimes situations required intervention and that intervention had been provided with appropriate restraint. Dalton studied both men, looking for the tells that experience had taught him to recognize. The defensive postures, the rehearsed answers, the subtle signs that someone was crafting a story rather than remembering one. He found nothing but tired honesty and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing you'd done the right thing, even when it was difficult. The sheriff had interviewed enough liars to recognize truth when he heard it. And everything about this situation felt authentic. The witnesses were consistent. The physical evidence supported their accounts, and the two men at the center of it all displayed none of the nervous energy that usually accompanied guilt or deception. "Well," Dalton said finally, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. "Sounds like a case of justified intervention to me. Grizzly's got a record longer than a summer day, and half the bars in 3 counties have banned him for exactly this kind of nonsense." He looked around the damaged saloon one more time, noting the extent of the destruction, but also the absence of serious injuries. "Ruby, you want to press charges for the property damage?" Ruby considered this for a moment, her practical nature weighing the costs and benefits of pursuing legal action against a man who probably couldn't afford to pay for the damage he'd caused. She'd been in business long enough to understand that sometimes cutting your losses was smarter than throwing good money after bad. "Grizzly's got no money anyway," she said finally, shrugging with the philosophical acceptance of someone who'd seen plenty of bad debts in her time. Can't get blood from a stone. Long as he stays away from my place, I'm willing to call it even. The decision was typical Ruby. Practical, fair, and focused on preventing future problems rather than punishing past ones. She'd rather have Grizzly banned from the premises than bankrupted by legal fees he couldn't pay anyway. Fair enough. Dalton tipped his hat to both legends, the gesture carrying more respect than his casual tone might have suggested. Gentlemen, you're free to go. Try to keep the heroics to the movie sets if possible. But as the official business wound down, something else was happening in the Silver Spur that spoke to deeper truths about heroism and recognition. The patrons who'd witnessed the confrontation were starting to approach Chuck and Dwayne, not for autographs or selfies, but to express something more profound than celebrity worship. A trucker with hands like leather and a face that spoke of decades spent on highways that stretched into infinity shook Dwayne's hand with the kind of grip that conveyed genuine respect. "Appreciate what you did for the old-timer," he said, his voice rough from years of shouting over diesel engines, but sincere in its gratitude. "Takes guts to stand up for someone who can't stand up for himself." The sentiment was echoed by others who'd witnessed the evening's events. An elderly woman who'd been hiding behind the pool table during the worst of the violence touched Chuck's arm gently, her gesture carrying the weight of personal memory. "My late husband would have done the same thing," she said, her voice thick with emotion that went beyond the immediate situation. "He always said, 'Real men protect the innocent.' Said it was what separated civilization from chaos." Her words carried the authority of someone who'd lived through enough history to understand the difference between heroism and its cheap imitations. She'd seen real heroes during wartime, had watched ordinary men make extraordinary choices when circumstances demanded it. Her recognition of those same qualities in Chuck and Dwayne was worth more than any professional accolade. Other patrons approached with similar expressions of gratitude, each offering their own perspective on what they'd witnessed. A young father thanked them for making the bar safe for his family. A veteran nodded his approval of their restraint and precision. Even some of the men who'd gotten caught up in the broader melee admitted they'd been inspired by the way the two legends had fought to minimize rather than maximize damage. But it was Old Man Sawyer who provided the evening's most meaningful moment. The elderly musician, who'd been quiet throughout the sheriff's investigation, finally made his way over to both men with the careful steps of someone whose body remembered conflicts from decades past. His guitar was slung across his back again, and his hands had stopped trembling. Whether from the passing of adrenaline or the return of something approaching peace was unclear. "I got something for you, boys," he said, reaching into his shirt pocket with the deliberate movements of someone performing a ritual that mattered. He pulled out two small objects, worn guitar picks that looked like they'd seen decades of use, their edges smoothed by countless hours of music making. The picks were beautiful in their simplicity, carved from what appeared to be aged wood that had been polished to a warm, honey-cold finish. They bore the patina of constant handling, the kind of wear that spoke to genuine use rather than decorative purpose. "Made these from the wood of the first bar I ever played in," Sawyer explained, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about something that clearly mattered deeply to him. "Place called Murphy's Roadhouse up near Lake Tahoe burned down in '73. But I saved a piece of the stage where I learned what music could mean to people." He paused, looking at the picks with a kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Been carrying them since Vietnam. Figured they were good luck. Helped me through some dark times when I wasn't sure music mattered anymore." The backstory transformed the simple gifts into something approaching sacred relics. These weren't tourist souvenirs or mass-produced memorabilia. They were pieces of personal history, tangible connections to a lifetime spent understanding the power of art to heal and inspire. But I reckon they'll do more good with you, too. Sawyer continued, extending one pick to each man with the solemnity of someone bestowing knighthood. You showed me something tonight that I thought was disappearing from the world. Reminded me that there are still people who understand that strength is meant to protect, not destroy. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was profound. In a world where respect was often confused with fear, where strength was measured in depth rather than character, the old musician was offering tokens that represented something increasingly rare. Authentic recognition from someone who'd seen the difference between heroes and pretenders. Chuck and Dwayne accepted the picks with the gravity they deserved, understanding that they'd just been given something more valuable than any award or accolade. These were symbols of approval from someone who'd lived long enough to distinguish between genuine heroism and its flashy imitations. Thank you, Chuck said simply, turning the pick over in his hands to examine its craftsmanship. The wood was warm to the touch, worn smooth by decades of use, and seemed to carry within its grain the echo of countless songs and stories. This means more than you know, Dwayne added, his voice thick with emotion that went beyond politeness. He understood the significance of the gift, not just the object itself, but what it represented about character, recognition, and the passing of something valuable from one generation to the next. As the evening wound down and the last of the patrons filtered out into the desert night, Ruby began the familiar ritual of closing up. She'd sweep up the glass, right the furniture that could be saved, and order replacements for what couldn't. By tomorrow night, the Silver Spur would be ready for business again, with new stories added to its collection and new legends woven into its history. But first, she had something to say to the two men who protected her establishment and her customers when protection was needed. You know, she said to Chuck and Dwayne as they prepared to leave, pausing in her sweeping to look at them directly. This place has seen a lot of tough guys over the years. Most of them were just trying to prove something to themselves or the world. They'd come in here looking for fights, looking for someone to beat down so they could feel bigger than they really were. She gestured around the damaged saloon, taking in the overturned furniture and broken glass with the philosophical acceptance of someone who'd seen cycles of destruction and renewal play out countless times. But you two. She paused, choosing her words carefully because they mattered. You proved something different. You proved that being strong means taking care of people who can't take care of themselves. That real power is knowing when not to use it. Her words carried the weight of earned wisdom, the perspective of someone who'd spent decades watching human nature reveal itself in moments of crisis. Ruby had seen cowards pretend to be heroes, and heroes pretend to be ordinary men. She'd learned to distinguish between authentic strength and its theatrical imitations. The Silver Spur's been here 50 years, she continued, leaning on her broom like it was a staff of office. It'll probably be here 50 more, long after all of us are dust. But tonight's going to be remembered. People are going to tell stories about what happened here, about the night two legends showed what legends are really supposed to be. Outside, the desert air was cool and clean, washed by stars that seemed close enough to pluck from the sky like fruit from a cosmic tree. Chuck and Dwayne stood beside their vehicles for a moment, both reluctant to end an evening that had started as accident and finished as friendship. The parking lot was quiet now, except for the distant sound of Grizzly being loaded into a sheriff's vehicle, and the soft buzz of neon signs that had witnessed everything, without judgment. The Silver Spur stood behind them like a monument to the complexity of human nature. capable of housing both the worst and best impulses of the people who gathered within its walls. "You ever get tired of it?" Dwayne asked, looking back at the neon-lit saloon where their legend had been cemented in broken furniture and grateful tears. People expecting you to be the hero all the time. The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. It spoke to the burden of reputation, the way fame could become a prison as much as a privilege. When people knew who you were, when they had expectations about how you should behave, every moment became a performance, whether you wanted it to be or not. Chuck was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with a thoughtfulness that had made him more than just another action star. He'd spent decades thinking about responsibility and legacy, about what it meant to be looked up to and how to handle that trust without being crushed by its weight. "Used to think it was a burden," he said finally, his voice carrying the reflection of someone who'd wrestled with these questions for years. All those expectations, all that responsibility, people wanting you to be perfect, to always make the right choice, to never show weakness or uncertainty. He looked up at the stars, those distant points of light that had guided travelers for millennia without ever asking for recognition or reward. But tonight reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. Chuck continued, his tone shifting to something approaching revelation. "It's not about being the hero people expect you to be. It's about being the person you choose to be when nobody's watching." He paused, considering his own words and finding truth in them. Though I suppose tonight everybody was watching. The observation carried both humor and wisdom, acknowledging the paradox of their situation while pointing toward deeper truths about character and choice. They had been watched tonight by patrons with camera phones, by witnesses who would tell stories for years to come, by a young waitress who'd learned something about heroism, and an old musician who'd been reminded that his faith in human goodness wasn't misplaced. But more importantly, they'd been watched by their own consciences, by the internal moral compasses that had guided them to step forward when stepping aside would have been easier. They shook hands one more time before going their separate ways, Chuck heading north toward his ranch, where silence and solitude waited. Dwayne pointing his rental car back toward the interstate and whatever obligations awaited him in the world of schedules and scripts and carefully managed public appearances. But both men carried something with them that they hadn't possessed when the evening started. A reminder that strength without compassion was just violence in expensive packaging. That real power came from knowing when not to use it, and that sometimes, in the most unlikely places, you could find the truest measure of who you really were. The Silver Spur Saloon settled into quiet as the desert reclaimed its domain. The neon signs buzzed softly, casting their colored light onto empty parking spaces where legends had stood, and ordinary people had been reminded of their capacity for extraordinary grace. Inside, the ghosts of 1,000 stories whispered in the shadows, adding one more tale to the collection. The night two icons proved that heroism wasn't about winning fights, but about fighting for what was worth protecting. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, its voice carrying across the vast Nevada emptiness, like a song about honor, courage, and the kinds of men who still believed that doing right was more important than being right. The night was quiet now, the violence spent and the lessons learned, but its echoes would be heard for years to come. In the stories told by witnesses, in the songs played by an old musician whose faith had been restored, and in the hearts of two men who'd rediscovered what it meant to be heroes in a world that had almost forgotten what heroes were for. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.